Hey, this is David Rovics. I'm going to be shortly joined by other folks. We are doing a monthly broadcast, more or less under the auspices of Song News Network, where we talk to people who are one way or another involved with music and politics and the intersection thereof. And this can be found archived on KBOO's Facebook page in the video section, as well as on the Facebook page of Popular Resistance and on my Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, and what else am I missing? Something else pages. And it all goes out in podcast form afterwards if you look for This Week with David Rovics wherever you get your podcasts. And today, me and Paula DeAngelis are talking with Mic Crenshaw. That's actually a painting behind Mike. It's that Mike.
Hello.
Painting. There's Mike. And just for the purposes of brief intro for those who don't know, Mike is a fantastic hip hop artist and co-founder as well of Anti-Racist Action several decades ago. And he's coming out with a new book on PM Press, very closely related to the subject at hand, all those aforementioned subjects. And he has just put out very recently a 11-part podcast series called It Did Happen Here, which I have just listened to in all 11 episodes, and it is just amazing, wonderful education. And I just want to tell everybody to download the podcast, which is free wherever you get your podcasts. Just look for It Did Happen Here. Absolutely fantastic stuff. And this is all basically the sort of subject material that we wanted to talk to Mike about today. But that's there's the intro anyway. And I mean, for one thing, listening to the podcast, It Did Happen Here, being also a big fan of your music, your music made a lot more sense, actually, listening to the podcast, because you actually come very much out of the punk rock scene, and the screaming electric guitars that are often the backdrop to your vocals are very much, they belong there even more than I thought they did. Wow. Yeah. But the podcast, is about basically, just to put it into a little, for people who haven't heard it yet, the 80s and 90s anti-fascist scene in Portland, Oregon here, where Mike and I both are. Paula is in Adelaide, Australia. Where there's also an anti-fascist scene, but of course, so many of these patterns that you talk about that happen in Minneapolis and in Portland. One of the things that's so fascinating about the whole thing is how these were repeated in so many different places around the world, where people didn't necessarily have any contact with each other, but these same kinds of patterns, with the rise of these right-wing groups and the rise of people who wanted to stand up against them, were happening. But I guess having sort of just introduced the podcast a little bit there, so people have some idea of what we're talking about, I was putting together questions as I was going, and for one thing, I was just wondering, the podcast has now been out, at least some of it has been out now for several months, and I'm just wondering, first of all, what kind of feedback you've gotten from people, and if there are people you've heard from who understand things about the scene that you're talking about in different ways, or never knew it existed, or what kinds of feedback you've been getting.
Well, there's been really positive feedback from those of us who were involved. Some of my former colleagues and comrades and friends who are deeply appreciative that the story that we share, some of the stories that we share about lives we've led, is getting exposure in a way that is really cohesive and well produced. I mean, the quality of the production has really helped impact people the way we hoped it would. In fact, the quality of the production, shout out to Aaron Yankee, Mo Balstern, Selena Flores, Julie Perini, and Icky, that's our production team. Because it just exceeded what my own expectations of it are. And the podcast has been able to manifest in a way that exceeds what I could have done as an individual. So I'm happy about that. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the level I hate to do this, but there are hierarchies in terms of where people are at in relation to a trajectory. And in relation to a trajectory that I've been on, in terms of trying to gain exposure for projects, for my creative work, for some of the expression and critical thinking that's been so much a part of my development, the levels of accomplishment of people who are reaching out to me to give feedback has been heightened. So I've had some pretty significant journalists and celebrity type people reach out to me directly and say, hey, this podcast is really good. And, that feels good.
Yeah, great. Are they actually sharing it? And is it getting some attention in those kinds of circles that celebrities have access to?
I'm assuming it is. I'm not badgering people.
Oh, but you're on Twitter, Mike. So
I'm going to tweet more. David is, for the people listening and watching, David is coaching me on how to be a multi-billionaire. So soon I'll be a household name all over Earth. But
as soon as he starts a Twitter account.
It's a little difficult for me to, I'm just learning how to accept compliments, honestly, and actually like be present with that and appreciate it and not feel like I have to self-deprecate or something. And I'll get better at asking. I want to feel like when I ask people to share and promote what I'm up to, that it's coming from a genuine place and not a place of me not really being present when I ask. Yeah. Because that's something that loses my respect when I feel like people are just kind of like generically pushing something, like spamming me. It's hard for me to go with that,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But somebody should, some of those same people who broadcasted those, some very good and somewhat reminiscent to the. There's been a series on BBC World Service, which was, I think, very good. Actually, that somebody she's involved. She's here in Portland, Leah. Anyway, the host is somebody here in Portland who did this series on BBC World Service that was about sort of where the Oklahoma City bombing came from, that sort of Christian patriot movement and where they came from and the origins of that whole thing, and sort of culminating in Oklahoma City, and the people who did that should be taking up this one and broadcasting it on BBC World Service. So
right.
That's my next plan. Not that I have any contacts there, but that's where I think it should get a bigger audience. But all the good things should get bigger audiences, of course.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that came up in the course of the podcast that I thought were so those little light bulb moments where I'm just got me thinking, where you kind of stop so you can think before, because you can't really listen and think at the same time too well, kind of thing. But where somebody was talking about how difficult it is to organize as a subculture. And this sort of the problem that was, maybe, I don't know if it was particular to the scene then, but I think there's a lot of commonalities between aspects of the scene then and a lot of stuff that's been going on just in the past few years in Portland and elsewhere, where this whole question of subcultural organizing, or trying to sort of reach out more broadly to appeal to a broader sort of array of society, and because you guys in the thing in the podcast, people are often talking about how people were dressing, which was great because of course it's a podcast, so we can't see anything, so it's important to know how people are dressing, and there was a lot of spikes involved in a lot of clothing, so unusual numbers of spikes and spiky hair and spiky things pointing out of jackets, and things that we're all familiar with who've hung out in the scene. But it's also like, I've played gigs where part of the audience like clutched their purses to avoid the other part of the audience, which they didn't realize were also going into the gig, because these guys with spikes look scary,
Yeah, Go ahead, Paula. What were you gonna say?
I've seen that happen at David's gigs.
The culture, the subculture, was fringe. You know, it was underground, and a lot of us are proud of that element. You know, we intentionally did. We wanted to intentionally move away from mainstream society, and that's where a lot of us found the confrontation between us and the neo-fascists, because at that time the neo-fascists and the racists were targeting the underground culture as a platform to do their demographic organizing. But what we've seen in the years since is that they've gone into a broader swath of expanding their base, you know, into more mainstream society, because what they started to recognize was that the mainstream society was going to have a lot of people with similar conditions going on in their minds and in their consciousness that would appeal to some of the same ideas. Some of the same ideas would be appealing to them. And I'm talking specifically about angry, frustrated, disenfranchised white folks. And that anywhere we see a population of white people in the world today, there's going to be a significant amount of them who are upset about the future and what they see in terms of opportunities for privilege and power, and to maintain an entitled privileged position. And they want to do something about it because it scares them to think that they're going to lose their position that's been created through these processes that have happened throughout history. And so I think it was actually really intelligent and advantageous for the right to not stay in this underground fringe
right
type of lane, and to go broader with their outreach. And that's what we see now. So the Proud Boys and the people like that who are part of these right-wing, ultra-right, alt-right formations today look less like punk rockers and just more like normal guys.
Mm-hmm. And increasingly more and more, like, I mean, it's oftentimes intentionally wearing all black in order to blend in with the black bloc and that sort of thing, and growing beards and all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah.
One of the themes that is, you know, very much a part of the whole podcast series is how much a role violence obviously played in self-defense against violent fascists. But so much violence and people killed and people traumatized and permanently injured and then the aspect of which may be particular to the hard sort of subcultural organizing thing of like people talking about how maybe particularly in a city like Portland at the time, that as punks they might get targeted for being punks or get targeted for being anti-fascist punks, depending on who was you might be getting confronted by. But the what a lot of people seem to agree on was that as more violent encounters happened, that there were the sort of twofold aspects. It seemed like on the one hand, there was a lot of the fascists were properly intimidated by the fact that people were defending themselves and were not as aggressive in many ways in many of the different sort of situations where they were intimidating people in Portland. But at the same time, there was the sort of, on the other hand, more and more people going around with firearms. And that also just both of those trends just sound so familiar too in terms of the past few years. And I just wonder just what you got to say about both of those trends and in terms of reflection.
Well, there's nothing new under the sun. And in my own lifetime, there are things that I experienced along a timeline in my development and growth chronologically that I'm sure other people experience in their own way before me. And I can say that with confidence because I've watched things go away and come back in my own lifetime. So in terms of violence, there was in the Reagan years when we were in the heat of our struggles against the violent neo-Nazi crews, the Hammerskins, the White Knights, elements of the Ku Klux Klan, different neo-Nazi factions and some of their sympathizers. Simultaneously, there was a explosion of the drug trade, and crack cocaine specifically happening in a lot of the working class Black neighborhoods. So there was like this parallel tracks while we were engaged in street warfare against neo-Nazis. A lot of the gangs were engaged in this kind of like horizontal economic warfare over control of the drug trade. And at that time, we saw a lot of automatic, semi-automatic assault rifles flooding into availability and accessibility, whether it was in gun stores, gun shows, or illicitly on the streets. So, and there's even people who talk about how the police were behind a lot of making those weapons available. I remember very specifically in about 87, 88, going into some local gun shops and finding these knockoff AK-47s for $300, $400. Sometimes, as low as a couple $100, and being really excited about that. And a couple of my good friends, that was the beginning of their relationship with assault rifles because they were super affordable and available. So this is back in 88, 87. And mass shootings weren't as much of a thing back then, but people arming themselves because they perceived it as a means to empower themselves in the face of an imminent threat in their community was a thing. So I don't really see a lot of difference between that and what happened this past summer when Proud Boys started attacking people, started attacking anti-fascists, anti-racists, and people who were part of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations with vehicles and bear spray and showing up and, jumping people and assaulting people. A lot of us had to ask this question, well, do I need to arm myself, to create better self-defense strategy, tactic, preparedness? And that's something that I had to actually go through some legal processes to make sure that I could legally own firearms because I had some prior convictions. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to legally own a firearm. I've been told that I couldn't. So I cleared all that up and gotten a better position if I choose to protect myself with lethal firearms. But and that's me just speaking from my point of view as an activist. I'm not even one of these people that's a reactionary. The people who we stereotypically associate on the right wing side with being armed and having an affinity for assault weapons. There's a stereotype in the trope of the mass shooter as a frustrated white man who's angry, right? That's what comes to a lot of our minds as a reflex. And so, there's just a lot of questions about where we're headed as a society in terms of what are our communities really what's the climate gonna be like in terms of violence and self-defense?
Isn't it so hard to say? I mean, I know it's always so hard to make any kind of predictions. And if you were to ask me 2 years ago if there was possibly going to be the kind of movement that we've had in Portland over the past year, I would have said it no, because the city's been so gentrified over the past 20 years that I'm just surprised that there's so many people out in the streets. Because I mean, I don't mean to, cast aspersions on anybody that can afford to spend $500,000 on a house, which is the average price of a house in the city right now. But and of course, lots of people are here in the city who predate the housing crisis and whose families have been here for generations and all that. So I shouldn't be, saying the city. It's not like the city has completely changed, but there's been some pretty massive transformation in this city over the past since you've been here, much more even than since I've been here. And it's changed a lot since I've been here, and I've been here for only 14 years.
Yeah. I think the larger economic context is always a factor, even in kind of a root cause critical analysis of why are things happening. Like, we see symptoms on the street. We see it in mental illness. We see it in houselessness. We see it in closing businesses. We see the way that the pandemic has caused us to question the effectiveness and the efficiency and even the necessity of a lot of our practices in terms of commuting to work, how we exchange goods and services, how we use technology. A friend of mine was talking yesterday about the kind of escalation of technological development that continued to change industry and means of production and everybody's lifestyle over the last 150 years, with different forms of industrialization going into automation of jobs in the digital sphere. And how at a certain point, we went from these different types of ground-based transportation, the railroad, and then we jumped from the railroad into aviation, and now people can get on an airplane and fly across the earth in one day. And then we have the development of the space travel, but things seem to have stopped in terms of external development and things that physically go from point A to point B, and things have shifted into cyberspace, right? So we can look ahead and see and imagine that the way that's going to impact our lifestyles is that the population is going to be less mobile, especially in urban areas, and the population is going to be more sedentary and reliant on devices and technology and electronics to interact with the economy. And I don't know, I think our lives are changing in ways that we can, in a lot of ways, we can only anticipate in our imaginations, but it doesn't take too long to find out because it happens so quickly.
Yeah. And it's just like just when I think about some of the stuff like that happened in the podcast, right? Like just the idea of people with radically differing political philosophies having any interest in being in the same physical spaces at the same time, like going to the same concert at the same, it just sounds so quaint. Because now, like, why would anybody do that? Of course, now we can be in our own echo chambers in separate corners of the internet. And also somebody, Mark Manley in Oklahoma, is asking what you think about, I think we know your answer, but what thoughts you might have on Trump starting his own social media network, which, would just, I think, obviously, increase that problem, even more.
Well, yeah, just the tail end of what I was just saying, the development of cyberspace in the digital sphere as a frontier that is going to have dominant influence on our consciousness and our behavior. So, of course, Trump wants to, a lot of what was utilized in Trump actually getting into office was the algorithmic dynamic of cyberspace, right? Social media.
Right.
And it seems only logical that he and his people that are advising him are going to look at their base and understand that masses of people can be moved further right and into deeper loyalty through the use of social media. So of course he's going to launch his own platform. He saw the way that the so-called liberals, right? Anybody that's not down with his way of thinking and the way of thinking of his base were able to pressure the tech giants to ban him or to cancel him. And that's, he has to contend with that.
How has we're getting onto a tangent here, if you don't mind, but how has that? Have you seen any impact of the whole like of him losing his Twitter? And like I know a lot of, especially socialists in Britain, especially like members of the Socialist Workers' Party, who have lost their Facebook pages. But I mean, it doesn't seem to have happened as much in some parts of the world as in others. But has this hit your circles much in the way of people losing their accounts?
Well, yeah, a lot of friends of mine typically on a regular basis wind up in what they call Facebook jail, for expressing their points of view, usually in response to some pretty extreme right-wing points of view. They'll say something critical and then they'll get banned. So what we see a bias, right? There's this digital bias that happens in social media. For some reason, I haven't come across it. I think some of what I express is pretty radical and pretty far left, but maybe they want to keep it up so they can just keep tabs on me. I have no idea. It's hard to verify anything, and there's not a lot of transparency, and anytime you do get in trouble on a social media platform, when you try to have access to whoever you need to get your stuff going again, it's not like a direct conversation. You have to message them and then you have to wait for them to message you. But it's out of your hands. You've been stripped of your so-called freedom or whatever, of your power to change the circumstance. They have power. Whoever controls the platform has power to censor you, but you don't have any recourse often.
Yeah, that's the general dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah, so creating, and maybe more of us on the left, more of us radical folks, we need to be thinking about the technology and how do we learn it so we have control over our own platforms as well.
Yep, right, that's for sure, huh? Paula,
So
please.
can I just say on that, I often find that whole process, historically speaking, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg have been very reluctant to implement any kind of, censorship or control of what people do. And they got pressured into it. And what happens, I think, mostly is it's a behind the scenes politics thing. The people who get banned or blocked on Facebook do so because somebody reports them.
Right.
And I've got friends who get into massive fights on Facebook with neo-Nazis for fun, right? And they get blocked all the time because what happens is those people can't handle the argument anymore, report them to Facebook, and Facebook will just go, you've done the community guidelines thing, right? And then you have to get into that argument. So it's a strange mixture of just mathematics and algorithms and robots and factional politics, I guess. So, knowing that stuff is really important, I think, when as you say, we need to have a better understanding of how all that stuff works and how to counter it. Yeah.
Yeah, and Paula, there's a lot of questions about implicit bias in terms of how the programming of AI gets implemented. And then there's layers. There's a couple feedback loops, because I've experienced a couple of trainings recently that I had to go to for grant administration. And I realized that the trainings were designed by AI, and that the people that were administering or facilitating the training weren't actually behaving like humans. They were human beings who were trying to direct us into thinking like AI. It was a distinct sensation. I was like, this is not really an organic experience.
No,
it's a very linear way of consuming information.
Yeah.
And I suspect that a lot of the information is generated by AI to increase efficiency. And I told a woman at the bank about it. She was complaining about, she turned and she showed me her screen. She was like, this is what I have to do every hour, every day. And she was talking about how the amount of employees that are scheduled to come into the bank are being dictated by these computers. And often what will wind up happening is they'll be understaffed. And there'll be these lines out the door. So the efficiency that the AI is coming up with is actually not talking correctly to the realities of how people are living.
Yes. Nor does anybody really have any interest in making it do that.
No.
Quite the opposite. It's a very effective social control technique, and there's all sorts of ways where we are like, how do you organize in a workplace that's remote?
Right.
How do you shut down the court?
Turn up at work and talk to people in your breaks. And I've got a friend who's dealing with that at the moment. That's one of the effects of working from home. She's really unhappy about a lot of the ways they've been treated, but she doesn't know how anyone else feels about that.
Talk on some monitored Zoom line. Yeah.
Well, I've suggested that to her, but it's going to take people in office-based jobs a while to get to that, I think.
Mike, was the title "It Did Happen Here" was that's a reference to the book "It Could Happen Here"? Is it? Do you know, or was that a conscious reference?
Somebody else asked me about "It Could Happen Here," and I went searching for it, and I found something that seemed like there could have been some intersection, but I forgot what it was.
I mean, I haven't actually read the book, but it's apparently about the possible fascist future of the United States with a very Trump-like character as the main character, not like a Hitler-like character, but a very American Trump-like character as the fascist central character in the book. I think it's a book from a long time ago. I can't remember, if it was the 80s or something, but I just figured since he's talking about it could happen here, and you're saying, well, actually, kind of did, not necessarily the Third Reich, but we've certainly got our share of fascists, and of course during the Third Reich in Germany we had loads of Nazis in the United States who were very openly
was it the Bundesliga or something?
It was huge. I mean, there was I can't remember who they'd have speaking tours in fill stadiums around the country.
Madison Square Garden had like a 30,000 attendee Nazi rally.
Right.
Yeah, I think it was called the Bundes something or other was the name of that specific Nazi party in the United States, and they had all types of social activities and cultural camps all over the country. Fascinating stuff, really. I mean, fascism is more, I think, for a lot of us, our reference point in our mind's eye is Nazi Germany. But I think it's more diverse than that. And I think that there are elements of it that are quite developed that have always existed in American society. Just looking at the fact where the term comes from, the fasci or the fasci, this bundle of sticks that dates all the way back to this emblem and symbol of power from the Roman Empire. And then when you see that bundle of sticks with the axe blade on it, with the ropes around it, you start to see it everywhere. It was on dimes. It was in the halls of Congress. It's on all these seals for parts of to represent different organizations that exist in society. So, in that sense, fascism's never left, right?
Yeah.
Since the beginning of empire, it's always been present in how we organize civilization and society, and also. If we, what was it? Mussolini's speechwriter said it should more appropriately be called corporatism because it's really this marriage of state interests and corporate interests. And in that regard, a friend of mine he published a podcast, and I need to get the link and share it with people, talking very specifically about Target and the Target Corporation that has the retail stores, how they had purchased a multi-million-dollar surveillance camera system in downtown Minneapolis, and then they used it along with this nerve center where the monitors could surveil what was going on, and the Minneapolis police to target homeless, specifically houseless Black youth on the streets of Minneapolis for arrest and incarceration. That sounds pretty fascist to me.
In every
where I go to buy socks and bath towels is like behind that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right. There's this false division between, like, I mean, there's this idea that the media tries to, or so much of the establishment tries to paint that fascism was this thing that happened in Germany during a few years, and basically anything else anywhere else in the world, it's not fascism. It's something else. It's just, and of course, if it's happening here, then by definition, it can't be fascism. It's America.
Right, 'cause we fought them in World War II, right?
That's right.
That makes our military anti-fascist. Come on.
By definition.
It's a very specific technique of the state, and it's deployed all the time. Is to well, there's an academic I used to read, and he calls it transhistoricizing. So you go, the only fascists ever were the Nazis,
right?
That's nobody else was ever a fascist, and so forth. So it's you've got the Holocaust. It's kind of like a natural disaster, and that way people don't look at trends. People don't look at the actual truth of it is that fascism is like the reserve tactic of capitalism, basically.
Come on,
right? It gets deployed when the other tactics aren't working,
right?
That's what it's for. It's the fallback position. It's messy, and it creates a lot of resistance, but it's a sign of desperation. If your state is deploying fascist techniques, that's because the resistance within the community is getting to a point where it can't handle it.
And I agree, and I also would add that for the most marginalized people in any society, they're always existing in a very raw expression of fascism. So for people who are homeless, destitute and on the street, for people who are incarcerated, the type of fascism that they exist in is considered normal, because it's an extreme level of social control. Yeah.
And that's exactly the reason that everybody that the state and all of the arms of the state try so hard to distract and isolate, distract the general population from what's going on in prisons,
right?
And keep prisoners out of the media. It's that's the technique. And I
saw a live feed from Oklahoma, actually. Are you guys aware of what's going on
from a prison in Oklahoma?
Yeah.
A live feed with somebody who got a cell phone smuggled in there?
Yeah, and they've got a guard.
There's a hostage situation?
Hostage situation, because they had no running water. Those guys,
wow.
The inmates hadn't showered for a couple of weeks. They showed pictures of the toilets overflowing, and they said, we're fed up.
Yeah.
So they had, as of yesterday, when I saw the live feed, they had a guard hostage. I haven't seen any reports on it in mainstream media, and that's such a scary situation, because the state is going to respond with asymmetrical force, and a couple of inmates at least are going to die in that situation. I can't see it ending any other way.
It's happened again and again. Going back to George Jackson and back and again and again and again. Jessica Mitford's book on the prison industrial complex, and she wrote that in the 70s. And you can read it and you go, I see it from the 70s. It happens again and again.
Yeah.
Mike, you're currently working on a book project for PM Press, and can you talk about that and how that came about and how it's going?
Yeah, a lot of these things developed simultaneously. The podcast kind of ran neck and neck with the book project. I met staff from PM Press, Joey Paxson and Terry Bisson. I was introduced to them through Walida and Marisha, good friend and comrade. The four of us went on a book tour for David Gilbert, who's in prison doing life sentences.
Whose son is now the district attorney of San Francisco.
Correct. Isn't that
very interesting?
Right. So David Gilbert is likely to not ever get out of prison. Him and Bernadette Dorn were two white activists who assisted the Black Liberation Army in bank robberies as getaway drivers. And for their role, they were caught, and David's still in prison. He wrote a book called Love and Struggle that PM Press put out. Walida asked me if I could do a book tour on behalf of David Gilbert and PM Press. So I did. I got even more familiar with his story and was able to correspond and write to him. And during the tour, we would drive up and down the West Coast, throughout the Pacific Northwest. And in the car, we had conversations. And that's where Joey and Terry got to hear me talk about my life story as a Black skinhead, a Minneapolis Baldy, and a co-founder of Anti-Racist Action, at which point they said, hey, you should write a book. Now, this is over a decade ago. So I procrastinated. But in recent years, I in struggling to write the book and get into the practice of writing, physically writing every day, I was thinking of ways to get the story out that would be less, where I would counter less resistance. And I said, well, what if I just went and talked to some of these people and recorded our conversations? Also, I did a proposal, like a draft proposal that was mostly focused on my story. And the feedback I got from PM Press was, you have an interesting story, but if you tell the stories of other people whose lives intersect other Black skinheads, it would be better for a broader audience. And so all those things were kind of circulating in my mind when I set out to record conversations between myself and other Black skinheads from Chicago and Minneapolis, a couple who live in Atlanta. These are people who were all involved in these struggles in the 80s and 90s, and we were all fighting together. And while I was doing that, my comrade and friend, Aaron Yankee, who was a longtime digital editor, radio editor for KBOO and program director for KBOO, approached me and said, the stories you're recording, would you want to help, would you consider contributing those to a podcast about anti-fascist and anti-racist organizing and activism? And I said, yeah. And so Aaron put together a team and got some resources. There's Marla Davis, is a woman who died, and she left a bequest. There's a certain amount of money she donated to KBOO for the specific purpose of developing program to counter the religious right and
wonderful
organizing. And so we were able to take some of that money from the bequest and fund putting together this team. And at that point, the content that I was collecting for Black Skinhead and our stories of anti-racist Black skinheads was contributed to this other effort that talked very specifically about the history of anti-fascist and anti-racist organizing in the 80s and 90s in Portland, Oregon. Mm-hmm. There was an intersection between the stories of these skinheads in the Midwest and people in Portland, because during the late 80s, the neo-Nazi problem was so extreme in Portland, Oregon, that those of us who were in the Midwest heard about it. Those of us who were part of the skinhead scene found out how bad the neo-Nazi skinhead scene was here. And some of us actually did a lot of work to expand the network of anti-racist organizing to Portland and came on road trips. And
you guys heard about how bad it was in Portland before the murder of Mulugata Surah. So it was already legendary in terms of how much conflict was going on the streets.
There's currently a bonus episode of It Did Happen Here. If you go to the website, I forget if it's It Did Happen Here podcast.net or .com, but I'll look that up while we're talking. The current bonus episode talks about Maximum Rock and Roll as a punk zine, right? It's in a media publication that we could pick up copies of in different bookstores across the country. And in that magazine was scene reports in which people would write about what was going on in their scenes. So between that information and people who were touring with bands and bandmates themselves, we would find out about what was going on out here and in other cities. So a handful of anti-racist skinheads and anti-fascists came to Portland prior to Mulugata Surah's murder. Thank you, Paula. And engaged in some direct action, so to speak. So through that, the relationship between anti-racists in Minneapolis and Chicago and Portland was strengthened. When I moved here, I had a very intimate relationship with people in the scene. And so all these relationships really are the basis of the content of the podcast.
Mm-hmm. And in the process of working on this book about Black skinheads, and you talked to folks all over the country, including a lot of folks that you had not priorly been in touch with, or was it pretty much your networking with people that you had networked with?
Yeah, I started with my network of friends. I talked to people that I knew and some of whom I hadn't seen. So it was a great opportunity to get back together with people I hadn't seen in over, 20 years.
It's great, isn't it? To have an excuse like that, like a project like that.
Yeah, it's good.
And I was thinking when you mentioned Atlanta, like how different it must have been, the Black skinhead. I mean, was there a scene? What do you call it? Was it enough of a thing you'd call it a Black skinhead scene? Or were Black skinheads pretty much always existing within a scene that was majority white? I mean,
there were always in the city. Every city I visited, there's some cities where there were more skinheads and more Latinx skinheads than there were white skinheads. Like I think in New York, for a time there were more Black and Latin skinheads than there were white skinheads. Probably at times in LA, there were more Black and Latinx skinheads than there were white skinheads if you were to put everybody together. But Chicago had a lot of Black and brown skinheads. In cities that were predominantly white, there were still Black skinheads. They just weren't the majority of the scene. I know there are a handful of Black skinheads in Atlanta. One of my best friends, David Jeffries, is a former Black skinhead who moved to Minneapolis from Atlanta. So I knew that there were Black skinheads in Atlanta, and I knew 2 or 3 Black skinheads in Portland that were here before I got here, and that were here when I arrived. So it's I think it's an interesting story for the specific reason that because of the propaganda and the dominant narrative that all skinheads are Nazis and always have been, just to say the term Black skinhead challenges that thinking. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that it's going to make people want to read and go, what the hell is he talking about?
It's a good provocative title, I would say. Just the combination of those 2 words should get a lot of people's attention. Make them want to click and at least see what that means. Yeah. Paula, you got any particular thoughts or questions come to mind?
Oh yeah, well, lots, but I think everything was pretty much covered. That's what
everything
I love about
was
these
covered.
shows.
That's never true.
The 2 of you talk, and
there's
then,
never,
no,
everything is never covered.
Yeah, no. we are getting to the end of the hour, and there are things I wish we could have got onto.
Oh, but we're not that close to the end. So give us a subject. You got one in particular?
Actually, I wanted to get onto a completely different topic, and that was to talk about your contributions to hip hop, Mark.
Oh wow!
So I'm completely fascinated by, at the moment, the international, like the global nature of hip hop, right?
Yeah.
And Killer Mike brought this up recently in an interview here. And wherever he goes in the world, hip hop is a thing, yeah. And you do a lot of this work internationally, and I think this is something, speaking as somebody who's been into American history for a long time, mm-hmm. I think people around the world and within the United States as well tend to assume that there's the United States and then there's the rest of the world. Right? It's a perception that everybody works hard to keep up for all the reasons we were talking about before. But I always find, and this is the case with radical movements in the United States, is that internationalist perspective is always there, right? Often you have to get it gets buried, but it's there. It's always there, and it's particularly prevalent amongst, the international working class. And in the United States, that means, you know, mostly black and non-white people, right?
Well,
you know, in a bizarre, complicated kind of a way, right? So, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll cut you off. You just want me to speak to those things, though?
I suppose how you got from punk to hip hop, but also just like I'm just interested in some stories about your you know, the African hip hop caravan, and also you recently did a show with some hip hop artists from Volgograd. That's so right. Cool. Right.
So so being a punk kid, I was also, you know, in touch with my own cultural experience being a black kid. So as I'm participating in the punk scene, I'm also participating in hip hop. And when I would go to the record store as a consumer, I would buy a 7-inch punk rock record, and I'd buy a 12-inch hip hop single at the same time. And all of us were like that. You know, we were into the street culture of that expressed itself in skateboarding and graffiti and breakdancing and rapping for fun. You know, rapping for fun while we're all hanging out and freestyling is something that's more authentic than what became the commercial rap music industry, where people become millionaires and become pop stars for expressing themselves through the genre. You know, before any of that, I was rapping to entertain my friends and myself long before I ever decided to take rap serious as a career. So as much as I was a black skinhead, I've been a hip hop head, you know, since I was a shorty, really. I remember the first hip hop songs I heard, Rapper's Delight and The Message, and The Breaks, you know, those songs by Curtis Blow and Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, kind of shaped my consciousness and development around how I consume music, because I always listened to black music. Coming from a black family, there was funk and soul and R&B, you know, and later reggae was always part of the household. But when I heard hip hop as a young person, it spoke to me in a way that immediately made clear that this was something new that was by us and for us. That the voice of hip hop was the voice of young urban black life. And so eventually it became a means for me to express myself that I felt was authentic to my experience. And when I came to Portland, I found myself in a very precarious, disgruntled place with what the type of work I was picking up. I was doing a lot of physical labor, manual labor. I wasn't happy. I was struggling economically. And so I turned to poetry and spoken word just to let off steam. And that got me involved with going and doing poetry slams. And it was at one such poetry slam that some of the musicians that were playing live music behind the poets approached me. One of them in particular, brother by the name of David Parks, asked me if I wanted to MC for a band he was putting together. And I said, sure. And so that was really the beginning of my career as an independent hip hop artist, was me searching for a way to express myself, to find more peace of mind, to center creativity as more an important part of my existence. And that led to an opportunity to be involved in the entertainment industry. And so we started doing shows. And I think once we did our first show, I think it was, for some reason, it was sold out. Like there was a good buzz around what was happening. It was at this club called La Luna. And once I got on stage and had the opportunity to say what I needed to say, you know, to a few hundred people, I was like, okay, this is it. I'm going to take this seriously. You know, I fell in love with that experience. And
it felt like a real valuable thing to be doing, right? As well as fun, right? I mean,
it did. For my own growth, for like my personal development, it was like a spiritual experience, because I realized that I could share my ideas and people wanted to hear what I had to say. And at that point, there was this contradiction between what was going on in popular rap music and what I had to say. And I knew that in popular rap music, everybody was being told to chase these ultra materialistic dreams through any means necessary. Whereas my experience was about let's seek liberation by any means necessary. And so I felt like I can do something with this contradiction that that I don't see enough evidence of in the world right now. And that became my purpose. And I've been doing it ever since. And there's another strain in there that's popular education, in that the natural necessity to have critical dialogue and discourse around these contradictions, like how culture is being used to create a very limited framework, a very limited spectrum in terms of what we imagine is possible for ourselves through the examples that we're oversaturated with. And the reality of the historical struggles that far outlasts the way that we're being impacted by entertainment, and looking at our opportunity to step into our roles in the liberatory process.
Yeah. Can I just say that I think history has proven you right, Mike, because the hip hop that lasts is that stuff, the Grandmaster Flash, right through Chuck D and Public Enemy, Cypress Hill, even, you know, and you know, that's the music that today is universal, you know, that speaks to everybody, speaks to marginalized people, oppressed people all over the world. So I think what you're saying, this is a really important observation, is that for you, punk and hip hop were both people's music. They're both music that come from your socioeconomic position, your class background, all of those things, and you brought them together. And for most people, we don't compartmentalize in terms of genres. No, right? People don't do that, and the working class doesn't do that anywhere in the world, really. They go, what works? Am I connecting with people? Then it's useful, you know.
But the music industry sure loves boxes.
And you know,
because you can only sell things in a consumerist way with boxes. That's, you know,
that's what they think.
Genre. You've said this to me before, David. Genres and genre characterizations are just marketing. Really,
it's marketing, but it's also like it's also specifically white supremacist marketing in terms of the music industry.
Correct.
There's JJ Jackson on YouTube. JJ Jackson is asking what some of your favorite contemporary radical hip hop artists are these days.
I always like Dead Prez. I like Sha Rock. I like No Name.
Sha Rock.
Yeah. You know, Immortal Technique. I have a kind of a in and out, you know, relationship. I don't listen to his music as much as I used to. There are local artists that I enjoy. People like Serge Severe. You know, sometimes I struggle to list all the artists that I like. There's Molly Karma is a good comrade from Germany that I actually met in Africa, and I wanted to circle back and talk about the international connection. There's a group I'm working with currently out of Russia called Hip Hop Union. It's a group of Russian artists like Mad Chief, Grandpa Grand. Big shout out to Sergey and Babish. So these are people that are hip hop artists and cultural activists like myself. When I say the term cultural activist, I first heard that term in Zimbabwe in South Africa, because there were these brothers and sisters, comrades of mine, who were part of these hip hop collectives that were anarchists, that were indigenous Africans, that were using hip hop as a means to organize in their community for education, human rights, and justice. And they defined themselves as cultural activists because they said, we're using culture to do this work of social justice organizing and activism. And so I was like, oh, well, that's what I do. The reason I was able to meet these guys was because there was a project that I was invited to be involved in because of my activism. I was going to high schools in Portland in the late 90s, early 2000s, and doing counter recruitment work, letting high school students know that they could opt out of the military recruiters having access to their private information around the type of household they live in and what their test scores were, because military recruiters were targeting low-income single-parent family kids, right? The most marginalized kids were the kids approaching strategically and saying, if you join our gang, basically you're gonna get free college, right?
The biggest gang on the planet,
man. So because of that work, American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization that was supporting social justice organizing project globally, invited me to go on a trip to Rwanda in 2004. And there was a conference on economic reconciliation, genocide reconciliation, youth empowerment, HIV/AIDS. At the time, Rwanda was still one of the poorest countries proportionately in Africa, which is a lot of why there wasn't a lot of intervention when the genocide had taken place back in 1994. So one of the conditions of that project was that I assist in a follow-up project coming from out of the, one of the outcomes of the conference was that those of us who participated had to co-create projects with some of the activists in Africa. And one of those projects was to help build a computer center. This project was created by African activists who were working in youth empowerment and economic reconciliation, and they wanted to build computer centers so that young people in the region could become computer literate and help create more economic opportunities for their lives. And when I decided I would help with the project, I didn't really know how I was gonna go about helping build a computer center. So when I got back to Portland, my friend and I started a business and got Education Without Borders to be fiscal sponsor and free donated computers. And then we had hip hop concerts to basically help raise money to ship computers that they donated, because the shipping of the computers was actually the greatest expense. I think the first pallet of computers that we shipped cost like $7,000 to get from here to Africa.
Shipping.
But in doing that, it helped me to have a reason to reach out to some of these other hip hop artists like Dead Prez and Immortal Technique specifically, to say, hey, you guys are making politically conscious, revolutionary, radical content, and you're using hip hop as a platform. That's what I'm doing. Can you guys help assist in this project? We need to get these computer centers built in one of the poorest countries in Central Africa. And they said, sure. And so that actually gave me an opportunity to build working relationships with other hip hop artists doing similar work who are a lot more exposed and had larger audiences than myself. That project led to, it reverberated. There was a buzz about the project because there were people from numerous countries in Africa who had participated in the conference. They took word of that project back to their communities. And then because of that, I was invited to play a music festival in Zimbabwe in 2012 called the Shoko Festival. And it was at the Shoko Festival I met cultural activists from South Africa and Zimbabwe who had heard about the work that I'd done. And they were working on a project called the African Caravan that was hosted and organized by African hip hop collectives.
It was a project called what? You broke up for a second.
African Hip Hop Caravan. Africa spelled with a K, AFRIKAN. And so in 2013, I went and participated in the first African Hip Hop Caravan. And we did Zimbabwe and 2 cities in South Africa, Cape Town, Johannesburg. And then I went back consecutive years. We added Tanzania and Nairobi, Kenya to that. And that was one of the greatest experiences of my life. And it was through that experience that I got invited to the Trinity International Hip Hop Festival in Hartford, Connecticut. And that's where I got roomed. My roommate was this hip hop artist from Russia, Sergey Ivanov. And at that point, that was 2016. And Sergey was like, would you consider coming to Russia? And I was like, sure. So finally, 3 years later, 2019, I got to go to Russia and do a very similar model to what we do on the African Hip Hop Caravan, which is to do free shows for youth in community centers, schools, and institutions, and then also do paid performances at venues at night, and to lecture and engage in dialogue and perform and build community. So one of the outcomes of the Russia project was we got funded to do Russian hip hop cultural exchange. So that's what I'm engaged in currently, where we're doing these regular shows. One of them was in Volgograd, one of them was in Tolyatti, a couple other cities in Russia. We've been doing it all virtually because as soon as we got funding for the project, the pandemic hit.
Damn pandemics. When in your experience with Russia and Russian hip hop artists, are there any particular sort of particularities that pop up that come, like this is definitely a Russian scene, or that are, or is it more striking the commonalities between the scene there and elsewhere?
The people I've been exposed to, there are a lot of commonalities, and they're very intentionally, specifically using hip hop to counter dominant narratives of capitalist commercialism, because what they see in their country is a lot of, abject poverty, and especially in the rural areas, that what, if anything, people are getting in terms of entertainment and access to entertainment in a lot of these areas, it's this promotion of this hyper-capitalist, materialist type of hip hop that's causing a lot of people to think that it's all about selling dope and doing anything you can to get rich. And so they're going into these communities and saying, actually, there are other ways that we can use hip hop to transform and shift consciousness, to actually empower our communities and sustain life as opposed to being destructive. So those are the types of things that we're all doing in our respective communities. And that's why we came together and created this project and, submitted it for funding and got funded. The other thing about a lot of Russian hip hop artists that I've been able to interact with is that we're part of a global community of cultural activists that do intentionally use hip hop in certain ways. But in Russia specifically, and I find this to be true in a lot of the cities in Africa, in Arusha, Tanzania, and in Cape Town, there are parallel scenes. There are the commercial scenes. There are the people who want to get rich and do the stuff that we see in commercial hip hop. But in the underground scenes and in the conscious hip hop scenes, there's more of an affinity for all elements of hip hop. In addition to people wanting to be MCs and rappers, there's a lot of graffiti writing, there's a lot of DJing, and there's a lot of dance. Dance is very important. People are using b-boying and b-girling in really powerful ways in Russia and across Africa. I've seen it speak to people in ways that's more impactful even than just somebody on a microphone spitting rhyme.
And talking about sustaining scenes, sustaining people, as in this, whether we're being materialistic, is a very material world we're living in, and just today you have just launched a Patreon page, and it's too fresh to even be associated with a name yet. It's only like a jumbled bunch of letters and numbers, but soon it's going to actually be presumably patreon.com/Mic Crenshaw or something along those lines. When that, I think that you probably need to get a patron before you're allowed to use your name or some such thing. I don't know, but just to tell people out there, it's the page exists, and I just wonder, in the age of a collapsed music industry, in a scene when at least most of the funding for activism and the arts that I used to hear about and benefit from back in the 90s mostly doesn't exist anymore. And I don't know how a lot of people are surviving without Patreon. And just wondering if you got any particular thoughts on how hard it is to survive as either an activist or an artist in the modern American economy.
I've gotten used to doing everything all the time. I haven't paid for this next tattoo. I haven't even scheduled the appointment, but I was imagining that the next tattoo I get is just going to be the 3 words, doing it all, because I work countless hours. I don't even try to add them up anymore. And I've gotten used to being a workaholic. One of the reasons that I'm not just doing music is because I wouldn't survive if I just did music. And so I've taken some of my other skill sets in terms of activism and education, and, you know, now emerging as a writer, right? I've been writing lyrics for years. I've been writing poetry for years. So now I have to develop my literary pursuits, and it's because I have to survive, you know, and finding creative ways to answer the question of how I survive is more appealing to me than I'm not very good at doing things I'm not passionate about. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah, most people don't like bosses, right? If we could help it, right? Yeah.
But one day I want to be able to do 2 or 3 things instead of like 6 or 7 things.
Here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So everybody go look for Mic Crenshaw on Patreon, become patrons, and then if he gets a few hundred patrons, then he can stop. Paula's going to be one of them. I'm going to be one of them, and then there'll be a whole bunch more. And then Mike can only do 3 or 4 things instead of 5 or 6, and everybody will benefit as a result, because there will be even more music in the world that's really worth listening to, among other things. More music and more podcasts, I hope, would be 2 of the things you'll still keep doing if you don't have to do 6 or 7. And the book. Yeah, see, I want to read the book, so I hope all 3 of them are still. Yeah.
Can I just say at this point that thank you to PM Press for existing. Because they publish so many books that I want to read. So many. And they just do great work. And I know
there's going to be another one coming soon that you'll want to read.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, everybody can become friends of PM Press. Yeah, become patrons of Mike on Patreon, and then you can join friends of PM Press, and then you can sleep soundly at night. Yeah.
Yes,
that's for the plug.
Yeah.
Thank you for the time, both of you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
We'll talk to you sometime soon, and thanks everybody for tuning in to this discussion with Mic Crenshaw. And if you have not yet heard the podcast, and in all likelihood out there in the world you haven't yet, but you should, and it's amazing. It's really, really fantastic stuff. It did happen here. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. You can support Mike on Patreon. You can also find a whole lot of fantastic YouTube videos and a memoir, a book about Black skinheads coming out on PM Press soon. And I'll just stop listing your accomplishments now, because nobody's going to remember anything after the first 4. So, okay, and you can hear this archived on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, KBOO Community Radio, Song News Network, as well as on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/DRovix, or in podcast form if you look for This Week with David Rovix wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Remember, don't pay the rent unless you really have to. Mutual aid will get us through. And trust your neighbors. Bye for now.
Love and solidarity.